The Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885 was a crucial event in the history of European colonization of Africa. Convened by German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck in Berlin, the conference aimed to regulate European expansion in Africa and prevent conflicts among European powers. The 14 countries involved, including Germany, France, Britain, Portugal, and Belgium, divided the African continent among themselves, setting the stage for what became known as the Scramble for Africa. Significantly, no African leaders or representatives were invited to the conference, even though the decisions made would directly impact the continent. The major outcome of the conference was the principle of effective occupation, which required that European powers had to physically control a region in order to claim it as a colony. This led to the arbitrary drawing of borders across Africa, disregarding existing ethnic, cultural, and political boundaries. The borders established by the Berlin Conference continue to affect African countries today, often contributing to ethnic and political tensions. The legacy of the conference is widely criticized for its role in the exploitation of African resources and its lasting impact on Africa's post-colonial development. The demand for reparations from the countries involved in the Berlin Conference has been a significant and ongoing issue for African nations and descendants of those affected by colonial exploitation. Advocates argue that the countries responsible for the partition and colonization of Africa have a moral and, in some cases, legal obligation to address the harm done. This includes not only the extraction of resources, but also the social, cultural, and economic disruptions that continue to impact African nations and people of African descent worldwide. Countries like Belgium, France, and Britain have been the target of these demands due to their extensive colonial activities. The call for reparations has gained some traction, with activists and organizations in various countries pushing for acknowledgement, apologies, and compensation. Some European nations have taken steps to return cultural artifacts taken during the colonial period, while others have issued formal apologies or established development funds for former colonies. For instance, Germany recently agreed to pay reparations to Namibia for the early 20th century genocide against the Herero and Nama people. However, broad reparations on the scale sought by some African nations have not yet been realized, partly due to legal and political complexities, as well as resistance from some former colonial powers. The issue remains a prominent part of discussions on historical justice, with debates continuing in international forums about how best to address the legacies of colonialism and the responsibilities of former colonial powers. If reparations were pursued by every African nation impacted by the colonial decisions of the Berlin Conference, most of the current 54 African countries could potentially be eligible. Nearly all African nations were subject to colonial rule or territorial restructuring due to the conference, with the exception of Liberia and Ethiopia, which largely retained their sovereignty throughout the colonial period. The borders drawn at the conference led to the formation of many modern African states, often without regard to existing ethnic, linguistic, or cultural boundaries. Consequently, nearly every African country, especially those in regions with rich natural resources, was affected by colonial exploitation and the long-lasting impacts of economic and social disruption caused by European powers. While the specifics would depend on the criteria set for reparations, it's likely that most, if not all, African nations would have valid claims against one or more of the colonial powers involved in the Berlin Conference, given the continent-wide impact of these agreements on African societies, economies, and political structures. In recent years, several European countries have taken steps to return cultural artifacts to African nations, following demands for restitution of items taken during colonial rule. Some notable examples include: 1. Benin bronzes. Germany and the United Kingdom have returned or pledged to return significant numbers of Benin bronzes to Nigeria. These are intricately crafted plaques and sculptures looted from the Kingdom of Benin in present-day Nigeria by British forces in 1897. Germany has agreed to return hundreds of these artifacts, while some UK institutions have also started repatriation efforts. 2. Sacred Ethiopian artifacts. The United Kingdom has returned artifacts taken during the 1868 Battle of Magdala, including a ceremonial crown, a royal wedding dress, and sacred religious items. These were originally seized during British campaigns in Ethiopia. 3. Senegal's sword of El Hadj Omar Tall. France returned a historic Sorik sword that belonged to the revered West African leader and Islamic scholar El Hajj Omar Tall. The sword, which was taken during French colonial rule, was returned to Senegal in 2019 as part of broader discussions about restitution between France and Senegal. Museums and institutions. France has pledged to return numerous artifacts to Benin, including the Abomey treasures, which were taken during the French conquest of the Kingdom of Dahomey in 1892. The artifacts include royal thrones, statues, and other culturally significant items. 5. Kenya's sacred artifacts. The United Kingdom returned various religious artifacts and personal items significant to Kenyan communities, including items from the Mau Mau uprising. These repatriation efforts are part of a growing movement toward acknowledging the cultural and historical significance of these artifacts for their countries of origin. Despite these steps, many African nations continue to push for further restitution, as thousands of cultural artifacts remain in European museums and private collections. The British Museum in London is often referred to as a graveyard for African artifacts, with critics arguing that it houses an extensive collection of items taken from the continent during colonial rule. These artifacts, many obtained under contentious circumstances, are seen as a part of Africa's cultural heritage that was removed without consent. The museum's collection includes significant objects such as the Benin bronzes, which were taken from the Kingdom of Benin in modern-day Nigeria by British forces in 1897. The museum has thousands of other artifacts from various African nations, including Egyptian mummies, sacred Ethiopian items, and relics from Sudan, Kenya, and South Africa. Activists and governments from these countries have pushed for the return of these items, arguing that they were looted and are integral to the heritage and identity of African societies. While the British Museum has begun discussions about artifact restitution and loan agreements, it has generally resisted returning items permanently, often citing legal and logistical challenges. This stance has sparked ongoing debates and led to calls for more comprehensive restitution efforts across European museums that hold African artifacts. Calculating how much money would need to be paid out to African nations as reparations for colonial exploitation is highly complex and speculative. Several factors would influence the amount, including the specific historical injustices suffered by each country, the resources extracted, and the socio-economic damage caused by colonial rule. However, some estimates have been made to give an idea of the scale of reparations. For instance, a report by the African Union has proposed that the cost of colonialism and slavery to Africa could be as high as $100 trillion when considering the extraction of resources, the disruption of economies, and the long-term effects on infrastructure, education, and public health. This number would include not just the immediate financial gains from looting and resource extraction, but also the lost economic potential, social inequality, and the damage to cultural heritage. For example, in 2017, an African economic historian suggested that Britain alone could owe around £20 trillion, $26 trillion, in reparations for the damage caused by its colonial rule in Africa. This figure comes from an analysis of resources stolen, human suffering, and the impact of imperial policies on African development. The challenge, however, lies in determining how to fairly distribute such reparations, as well as agreeing on what constitutes appropriate compensation for the enduring impacts of colonialism. Moreover, the legacy of colonialism is not just financial. It also involves addressing the systemic inequalities and injustices that continue to affect post-colonial societies. There are also significant debates about how reparations would be calculated and paid, whether they should involve direct financial payments, debt relief, educational support, or investments in infrastructure. Therefore, while estimates of the financial cost can give us a sense of the scale, the process of reparations would likely involve much more than simple payouts. The financial cost of reparations for colonialism could potentially be staggering and may even threaten the economies of countries that were involved in colonizing Africa. If reparations were paid in the magnitude that some estimates suggest, such as the $100 trillion figure mentioned in some reports, it could cause severe economic strain on former colonial powers like the UK, France, Belgium, and others. This amount far exceeds the gross domestic product, GDP, of many countries, and would be difficult for these nations to pay out without extreme fiscal consequences. For example, if Britain were to pay the £20 trillion, roughly $26 trillion, estimated for its colonial damages, it would represent many multiples of its current GDP. These types of sums could destabilize economies, potentially leading to inflation, mass taxation, or even triggering debt crises. Moreover, the sheer logistical and legal complexity of such payments would make them hard to implement. In addition, the historical context complicates this issue. Many former colonial powers argue that reparations are not practical due to the centuries-long duration of colonialism and the varying levels of exploitation in different regions. These nations might also argue that other forms of restitution, such as development aid or investments in infrastructure, would be more feasible. However, advocates for reparations argue that these forms of assistance have often been insufficient and come with conditions that may not address the full extent of the damage caused by colonial rule. Despite these financial challenges, the call for reparations continues to gain traction, with more African countries and activists pushing for at least symbolic acknowledgement, apologies, and more concrete forms of restitution, like returning stolen cultural artifacts. Some advocate for debt cancellation, investment in education and healthcare, or financial support for developing economies as ways to achieve reparations without bankrupting colonial powers. Ultimately, while the financial burden may seem enormous, advocates argue that reparations should be seen as a way to address not just past wrongs, but also the systemic inequalities that continue to affect African nations today. The irony in the argument that former colonial powers cannot afford to pay reparations to African nations, while at the same time, many of these countries continue to exploit Africa's resources. Colonial powers benefited immensely from Africa's wealth, which was extracted through forced labor, resource exploitation, and violent subjugation. Even after independence, many of these nations and multinational corporations have continued to profit from Africa's natural resources, often with little regard for the development of African economies. This ongoing extraction, sometimes referred to as neocolonialism, includes practices like mining, oil extraction, and the export of raw materials, much of which is done without fair compensation to the local populations or the countries themselves. For example, countries like France and Belgium have long been involved in Africa's resource extraction, especially in countries like Democratic Republic of Congo, DRC, Chad, and Mali. French companies have been deeply involved in African oil extraction, while companies from both France and the UK continue to benefit from mining operations in nations such as South Africa and Ghana. These practices often occur within frameworks that allow companies to avoid paying taxes or providing fair wages, contributing to the continued economic imbalance between African nations and former colonial powers. Critics argue that this ongoing looting undermines the argument that reparations are not feasible. In fact, they believe that the wealth extracted from Africa could more than compensate for the damage caused by colonialism. Some reports suggest that Africa's wealth continues to be drained at a rate far greater than what would be needed for reparations. For instance, the African Union has estimated that Africa loses billions of dollars annually due to illicit financial flows, much of which is driven by the exploitation of natural resources and tax avoidance by foreign corporations. Moreover, this continued exploitation shows a stark contrast to the claims of former colonial powers that paying reparations would be financially impossible. Critics contend that if these countries can afford to sustain wealth derived from Africa's resources, they should be held accountable for the harm caused during the colonial era and the continued inequality in the post-colonial period. The call for reparations is not just about financial compensation, but also about acknowledgement and rectifying historical wrongs. It involves a recognition of how colonialism set up systems of economic disparity that continue to benefit former colonial powers, while African nations are left to struggle with poverty and underdevelopment. These discussions are vital to addressing the legacies of colonialism and working toward a more equitable global economic system. De Beers is indeed one of the largest companies benefiting from the exploitation of Africa's natural resources, particularly in the diamond mining sector. Founded in the late 19th century, the company has been deeply involved in diamond mining in southern Africa, including South Africa, Botswana, Namibia, and Zimbabwe. For decades, De Beers, alongside other multinational corporations, has played a major role in controlling the global diamond market. The company's practices have been heavily criticized for contributing to the exploitation of labor and the mismanagement of natural resources in African countries. Many workers in De Beers mines have faced harsh conditions, low wages, and a lack of benefits, while the wealth generated from the diamonds often does not reach the local communities. Moreover, De Beers' control of the diamond market has historically allowed the company to maintain monopolistic pricing, benefiting from the immense profits while local economies remain impoverished. In some African countries, particularly Botswana, De Beers has been part of joint ventures with governments, and some profits have been shared. However, critics argue that the terms of these agreements have often been disproportionately favorable to the company, leaving African nations with a fraction of the wealth generated by their natural resources. In the case of Botswana, while it has benefited from some diamond wealth, there are still significant disparities in wealth distribution and economic development. The issue of so-called blood diamonds has also brought global attention to the diamond industry, particularly after it was revealed that diamonds mined in conflict zones were being sold to fund armed groups and perpetuate violence. While the Kimberley process was introduced in 2003 to stop the trade of conflict diamonds, critics argue that it is still not effective enough in holding companies accountable for human rights abuses associated with diamond mining. In short, while companies like De Beers have contributed to the wealth of some African nations, they have also played a significant role in perpetuating economic exploitation. Calls for greater accountability and reparations for the exploitation of Africa's resources continue, as the wealth derived from these industries remains a point of contention. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe for more content, and leave a comment below. See you next time.